Good evening, and thank you for being here on this rainy Houston day for our lecture tonight by Dr. Bess Williamson from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Bess is a scholar of access and accessibility, and of course, because of that distinguished record, she will be talking to the school community today. We also welcome Bess because she's also a guest of our own Professor Dawn Finley, who received a bridge grant to do a research and a seminar on architecture and disability. Dawn will introduce Bess, as well as moderate the questions and answer session after Bess's talk. And Bess will also visit Dawn's seminar tomorrow to dive deeper into this conversation. I'm deeply grateful to Dawn for bringing this important topic to our school. In so many ways, the question of universal human rights, including access to space, reflects our school's renewed emphasis on global, planetary issues that affect all citizens of the world, from access and disability to environment and community. Without much more ado, please join me in welcoming Dawn Finley. Thank you.
Thank you, Igor. And full disclosure, Igor and I both prepared introductions, so I'm really curious to cross-reference notes afterwards. But welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining tonight. It's great to see, in addition to our Rice cohort, guests from the mayor's office, for people with disabilities, as well as faculty from our extended community. My introduction is admittedly a bit of an oversimplification of some very complex issues that I know that our guests this evening will unpack in a more sophisticated way. But historically, the methods and criteria for designing our built world, whether buildings, furniture, garments, or objects, bias a culturally and socially defined set of standard or typical human bodies and abilities, and overlook the access potentials and needs of individuals with disabilities. However, we know that the late 20th century disability civil rights activism and subsequent legislation ushered in critical new forms of design justice, equity, and public access to the built environment in the US, as did global design initiatives such as universal, inclusive, and design for all practices. While acknowledging the immense importance of this work and legislation, this somewhat narrow definition of access, which I don't know if we're left with it or if we have simply accepted it, limits our collective understanding and imagination of the potential of design through disability. It's not a stretch to generalize and say that in architectural design, whether practice or education, issues of human disability and access are not often foregrounded, not of significant importance, but tend to be peripheral concerns or even afterthoughts understood through technical, legislative concerns and building codes, rather than through social ambitions or more speculative design approaches. Tonight's lecture is connected to my new course, as Igor described, Body Plus, and this is a seminar that aims to unpack and inventively integrate issues of disability and disability rights in design practice and education through an expanded, nuanced ethos. I'm extremely pleased to introduce our guest this evening, who traveled from Chicago, Dr. Bess Williamson, whose scholarship connects the history of design with the history of disability in the United States. And I should note, she will be speaking with my students tomorrow in discussion, and all of this is possible through a Rice University Bridge Grant, which thank you to my Bridge supporters. Bess Williamson is an historian of design and material culture with a particular interest in social and political concerns in design. Her research examines how the concept of access is valued in contemporary design and what its consequences mean for the everyday lives of disabled people. She's a professor of art history, theory, and criticism at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. My first introduction to Bess's work was through her 2012 article, Getting a Grip. It has a longer title, but I know it is Getting a Grip, which if you have not read it, I highly recommend. It's an insightful history of essentially American industrial design in the late 20th century, and it connects culture, technology, politics, aesthetics. And like all of her work that I am familiar with, it's written in a direct and accessible way that always leaves me with a sense of open-ended optimism. Her first book, Accessible American A History of Disability in Design, released in 2019, explores the history of design responses to disability rights from 1945 to recent times. And Bess is the co-editor of Making Disability Modern, Design Histories. This is a collection of case studies of objects, buildings, and systems that essentially reflect changing design approaches to disability from the 18th century to our present moment. And in her current research, she explores the relationship between caregiving and design, some of which I hope she will share with us tonight. So please join me in welcoming Bess Williamson.
Thank you so much, Dawn and Igor. Thank you all for being here on this dark and rainy, dark and stormy night. I have some copies of the script for my talk, if there are people who would prefer to follow along by text. If you would, can you raise your hand? And I'm going to ask Tara, thank you so much for and thank you so much, Tara, who is passing those out, for significant prep work and hosting work for me here, as well as Dawn for the invitation and the Bridge grant. I'm going to do a little tech work here. Ooh. Hello, good evening. I'm a white middle-aged woman with metal-framed glasses, wearing a dark dress. The slide is a sepia-toned, long exposure action shot of an empty wheelchair swooshing across a page with my title today, Beyond Access, the Design of Disability Justice. And my name, Dr. Bess Williamson. I use she, her pronouns. And I spend a lot of time thinking about access and inclusion in the design world. And this is one of the images I often use to think about this, and it probably aligns with your expectations of what I might be talking about tonight, wheelchair access. And I'll get back to this image in a minute. But first, I'll talk about access more generally. I have to follow signs wherever I see them, and this large poster with the white international symbol of access against a black ground points our way to MD Anderson Hall tonight and brings us to the start of thinking about access. Recognizing disability not as a subject that's out there somewhere, but is in here, I ask us to proceed assuming a variety of lived experiences of disability in the room. Some may identify as disabled with life histories of illness or born difference, cognitive, sensory, mental, or physical. I myself have ADHD, something I didn't think was very related to my work for a long time, but have come to understand as a part of designed environments as well. More on this later. Some among us might have relational connection to disability, such as family members and loved ones' experiences. And given our current ongoing pandemic, in which several life-threatening viruses are circulating without much mitigation, I want us to also recognize that not everyone is here with us because of this, right? This talk will be on YouTube afterwards, and I'm thankful to my hosts for that. But as we have returned, we're no longer returning to in-person operations. We should nonetheless be aware of who's not here with us, who's avoiding public spaces still. In the next 40 minutes or so, I'll share some images, mostly from the last 50 years, showing how access became to be established as a requirement in American design, but also as something very contested and incomplete. So we can start, for example, in here. What kind of access do we have in here, in this space? This is an open space with a lot of flexibility for different sizes and arrangements of the group, but we've set it up with the expectation that you will all sit there and look up at me. We have expected that there might be some wheelchair users here, and there's a little bit of space there, but not a lot of space for a lot of wheelchairs, walkers, canes, or larger medical equipment. We can also think about how this event itself is accessible within larger systems of mobility and time. Today, with construction and rain, it's not very easy to get here. Although it's in the building where a lot of you are already working, so it meets you where you are. And my understanding is that the time is set up to most likely align with faculty and student schedules. Nonetheless, I'm sure that some people are not here because it's 6 o'clock, a peak time for child and family care work, and some students in particular might have other jobs in the evening. So many of these expectations around time, around space, around seating are standard for academic events. But there are some changes that we can make, right? We can think of like arranging design elements rather than maybe the board on which we play. For example, I can acknowledge here that there might be people in the room who want to stand up during this talk, or sit down on the floor, or lie on the floor, rather than sitting in your chairs, who might want to get up and move around during the talk. And I just want to open the permission to do that, something that we don't often always have permission to do. If you want to knit, or tap your foot, or stim during this talk, if you need to get out and walk in the hallway and come back, I want to invite you to do so. Another form of access that I can make is to use technologies that are increasingly built into our software. So I'm using Google's automatically generated captions, which provide a running talk of my text usually. These are AI generated captions, so we can imagine they draw on a database of spoken words that are biased toward male voices speaking with a standard American accent. And they build off dictionaries of most familiar common words in the English language, so they often make errors in obscure field-specific vocabulary or unfamiliar names. So there might be some unexpected content that comes up, a sort of double text as I'm speaking as well. I have provided the option for access copies, recognizing that you may all not want to constantly be looking at the screen or absorbing this talk only orally. And I will also provide image description as I go. I'll describe text and images on the screen, which creates access for people who are blind or have low vision, as well as those of you who might be reading at the same time. I say all of this feels like a lot that I'm listing to you, but these are mundane and often presented as neutral tools, either whether they're present or not present, right, or simply not discussed at all. Access tools and technologies are largely designed to be hidden, to be discrete. We most often notice them when they're not working. This form of access talk that I'm giving, sort of access preamble, is a nod to disability culture where access is not a sidebar, but is a necessity of gathering in an equitable way. And I've learned both these tools that I'm using and this mode of speaking about them from being in disability-centric spaces for nearly 20 years, especially drawing on the work here of Amy Hamrai, Margaret Price, Sandy Yee, and from the queer and people of color activists who formulated ideas of disability justice in the early 2000s, largely through the art and performance group Sin's Invalid. So now to the talk. I start with this installation from 2014 by the artist Park MacArthur. It's a white space gallery full of ramps. All of them are different textures and sizes. There are big, sort of official-looking ramps with black ground and yellow stripes, as well as much less official bits of plywood, some broken, some painted, spray painted, many reused. These are all ramps that have been provided for Park MacArthur, who's a wheelchair user, to have access at various art and culture sites in New York where she works. So some of them, for example, belong to the Whitney Museum Fellowship. a lot of small galleries which have an exemption for a single-step entrance. So they map out the irregularity of access for this particular wheelchair user. And they also touch on the scarcity of it, right? These individual ramps, each can be associated with a different space. But also because to bring these ramps in the gallery, MacArthur deliberately took them away from the institutions that first had them. In many of them, she left signs noting that access was temporarily not available in those spaces. So the move kind of gives this piece a bit of an edge. Honestly, as an advocate for access, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable. But it points to the realities of access. MacArthur's access as an up-and-coming young white artist in New York was possible, if often precarious. And there's something kind of cheeky as well here. In a gallery where people usually look at the walls are mostly blank. High up on the very top edge of the walls are blank blue signs, recognizable as sort of handicapped access blue signs, but with no text or symbols on them. So they seem to point out to some possibility beyond the basic ramp, some larger form of access, but that is not identified. The only thing at standard eye level is a text, the URL for a Wikipedia article for the writer and activist Marta Russell. Russell, who was a writer in the 1980s and 1990s in the US, is most known for a book called Beyond Ramps, which took aim at the limits of the American approach to access in the Americans with Disabilities Act, passed in 1990. Marta Russell called the ADA free market civil rights in a public relations era. According to Russell and other critics that she worked with, the way the US approached access law in the waning 20th century civil rights era, quote, disability rights would be a PR bonanza because civil rights could be softened with language like, quote, bringing disabled people into the mainstream. MacArthur's installation is a helpful starting point for us thinking about access as simultaneously a civil right necessity and something that's also susceptible to PR bonanzas, to surface readings, to easy answers, right, to a single response rather than a more complex one. And here I bring up the term disability justice to speak to the gap between civil rights law, such as the ADA, and the realities that are produced out of legal and design shortfalls. Here we have several representations of legal access, the ramps, the signs above, but the inconsistency of the ramps, along with the discomfort that is created in this gallery. It's a little hard to tell here, but the walkway here is very narrow, even narrow for MacArthur's own wheelchair. So people are kind of standing on top of each other in order to see these ramps or to pass through. These all point to Russell's critique and the argument that disability justice, not a term that she used as it was coined later, but that it requires more than just ramps. So this talk will review some histories of access that reveal designers from the 20th century. Some of them trained architects, some self-trained community activists who negotiated this gap between legal requirements and reality. What I hope they'll prompt us to think about is how everyday interactions with accessibility represent a starting point, right? A kind of prompt for further work in thinking about disability design rather than a resolution. So one figure whose work I'll highlight here is Ronald Mace, pictured here on the image on the left in the 1990s as an older white man sitting in a wheelchair with a fuzzy kind of landscape background. Mace was an architect, a trained architect, and also a wheelchair user after he had had a childhood case of polio. He attended North Carolina State University's architecture school, where he was actively discouraged from pursuing a career as an architect, as his professors doubted that he would be able to sustain the work of the profession, despite the fact that he managed to find his way to their top floor, elevatorless studio spaces consistently throughout his degree program. And as it turned out, at the time of his graduation in 1970 was, in fact, a quite fortuitous time to be practicing as an architect with a knowledge of accessibility, as it was a time when some of the first US states were incorporating wheelchair access into the building code. So Mace ended up, as an article on the right, from his hometown newspaper in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, shows that he built his career consulting on barriers with the quote from him, "Some of us do everything everybody else does." Some of us do everything anybody else does, which is this kind of logic around access that kind of chases its tail. Like everyone does something that everyone else already does. But Mace's work is fundamental to the history of accessible architecture in the US, despite the fact that he's not particularly well known. He authored many of the major accessible architecture regulations, including the Uniform Housing Code for Access and contributed to the regulations that accompanied the ADA. But in his earlier work, he began his work with the state of North Carolina, interpreting their code, both in buildings and in text. And even this early work shows some interesting confrontation of the shortfalls of the very same laws that he's working on. So in this book, for example, Illustrated Handbook of the North Carolina State Building Code, not the most glamorous kind of architectural book, but it's surprisingly interpretive as it shows illustrations that went along with the very bare bones first building codes that required forms of access in government buildings only. So the very first architectural codes were governed only federal government and then eventually state government buildings. He represents here, for example, on the cover, access as a kind of official form of construction with the international symbol of access, seeming to sort of roll up a plank that is on top of a staircase. And then this is a like landscape-oriented book, and then when you open it, the inner cover is this swooshing wheelchair image that I started my talk with. And this juxtaposition I find fascinating and sort of vexing. What does this juxtaposition do? The pairing always strikes me as almost like a semiotics lesson, right? All these different versions of the wheelchair, the symbolic wheelchair and the swooshing one. The idea that maybe underneath every ramp is a staircase of some kind, or does every ramp replace a staircase? But there's sort of the shadow or the ghost of a staircase always there. And then there's also this very like 1970s sort of flower shape or star that the wheelchair seems to be moving towards. And Mace used this symbol throughout the book of an asterisk to show preferred forms. So even within this government illustration book, he shows not only the code as it exists, but how to go beyond it. So for example, these are the drawings that illustrate, so to be clear, the code itself had no illustrations in it when it was adopted in 1970, and so he adds illustrations, and these are some of the earliest and most complete illustrations of sort of architectural interpretation of what these codes might look like. And so this is for a ramp to a platform at a doorway. And the excuse me, the drawing from above not only includes a wheelchair user, right, sort of giving us a sense of scale, but also gives us a sense of why there is the requirement to have a platform at the top of a ramp, right, rather than just a ramp that goes straight up to that doorway. And the reason why is that the wheelchair user needs to be able to stop there and be secure in order to open the door, right? And in fact, Mace adds this extra preferred margin on the right side of the door opening so that there's a little extra room to maneuver in opening a doorway towards oneself. Right, so this is how this kind of system works of showing the code, but then also showing a kind of extra preferred element as well. These technical drawings gave their architect audience a sense of why some of these requirements might be included, as well as like what they might look like. And they give us a clue to the work that Mace would become best known for. He coined the term universal design, which describes a form of design that included disabled and non-disabled people without separation. And this was his sort of preferred term of without separation whenever possible. And there are a lot of misconceptions about universal design. For example, that it must always be a single design for all users, or that it kind of erases disability by imagining a kind of universal, ideal one person who can use these design solutions. But here we can see a kind of example of how Mace approached this problem that he called universal design. Something designed for a disabled person, but when it gets the same level of design attention as the main doorway, for example, it produces a more generous design, a bit of extra space for that we can imagine addressing a variety of user needs, right? Holding a bunch of stuff or just not wanting to step backwards when opening the door. So here we have the code drawings, and interspersed among them are these variety of sort of stop motion photos, images in motion that show disabled people in space. And I find this also to be a remarkable documentation of how access works, right? Rather than access being a kind of build it and they will come, right? As if access doesn't exist until one builds a ramp. Instead, Mace shows how disabled people are already using public spaces, just with difficulty, right? Or with assistance. So here, for example, showing a person dragging another person in a wheelchair up a quite significant set of stairs, sort of shows the type of access that Mace lived his whole life with. They show access also as a human interaction, an experience that involves not just a singular person in a wheelchair. We can ask some questions here he doesn't really tell us, right? There's no text or explanation of these images. What is the relationship here? Is this a collaboration with one person directing and one person responding? Is it a reluctant help from a passerby? Is it an experience that one wheelchair user of the period described as terrifying each time they were dragged up a staircase? The image recalls what Mia Mingus calls access intimacy, the interaction that she as a disabled person has with others who might be disabled, might be not, who offer, as she calls it, quote, that elusive, hard to describe feeling when someone else gets your access needs. The very concept of access intimacy, and maybe it's being pictured here or maybe not, but the very idea of it is a reminder that architectural access can't be separated from the people who participate in it, both the disabled people in question and others who may step in to assist, who may need to arrange these tools and so on. The people who build it, who use it, and who make it possible might arrange for doors to be open, for sign interpretation, for flexibility in classrooms and workspaces, who don't have to be asked to turn the captions on in every meeting, who always remember your pronouns. Mingus describes these as forms of access intimacy. And she also uses some architectural imagery to describe this. She writes, I need it, meaning access intimacy, to literally be my whole self, because access is such an intimate part of my life as a queer, physically disabled woman of color adoptee. Without it, relationships exist under a glass ceiling or split by thick frosted windows with huge pieces of myself never being able to be reached. Ourselves in public may be changed by access. Oftentimes it's for the worst, the feeling of being blocked off, as Mingus describes, but when we're not acknowledged by design. But in other cases, it's an affirmation, a kind of clicking in place that has to do with relationships between people as much as it does with physical design and spaces. And so Mace sort of subtly and, without much explanation, seems to include these questions about access, or both the preferred approaches beyond and also the reality without these forms of architectural access. At the same time that he was working, this confrontation between disabled communities and the exclusions of modern architecture was also becoming explicit in an emerging disability rights movement in the 1970s. So this is an image from the independent living movement, the Berkeley, California-based group that became sort of the centerpiece of the political movement for the rights of disabled people in the United States. This group started in the 1960s in the kind of politicized atmosphere of Berkeley and the university there. And by the early 1970s, this group of disabled folks, largely wheelchair users but not exclusively, had created a grassroots social service agency called the Center for Independent Living that was an alternative to charitable or government supports run by and for disabled people. This is a cover of the Center for Independent Living's periodical, The Independent, in which several figures are moving across a sidewalk curb. 2 wheelchair users, 2 assistants, and on the far left of the frame, a barely visible person who's holding a white cane, showing us that there are blind folks involved in this effort as well. I'm struck by the similarity of this image to Mesa's stop-motion staircase image, right? They both depict access as it was in this moment in the 1970s, before widespread ramps and curb cuts. Access was not smooth, but instead took direct attention and community input. And this group that's pictured all the way on the right side, Hale Zukis, a white wheelchair user who's wearing a head cap that he used to work the controls of his mechanical wheelchair. Eric Dibner, a bushy, bearded, walking man who worked for many years as Hale's attendant and then became his colleague as an access expert at the center. An unidentified young woman in a wheelchair who's also being pushed by a walking man, and the image on the figure on the far left, who Eric Dibner helped me identify as a blind activist in the space named Dick Santos. The team's work resulted in a Berkeley wheelchair route. So they're not only being photographed just moving through the city of Berkeley, but doing a project where they mapped out the city and recommended to the city where there be over 100 wheelchair curb cuts be added to the city's infrastructure, creating what was the first contiguous wheelchair route in a public space anywhere, ever, right? As opposed to, for example, like in a hospital or on a university campus. This community mapped out, and here I'll show. So we're looking at a city grid here, and at the top of it is the University of California's campus. I think I can use my laser pointer up here. And then a city grid below with lots of little dots that show the locations of wheelchair curb cuts that create a link from the campus to the BART, the regional rail in the Bay Area, as well as, so there's a BART station down at sort of the bottom of a long route, and then also a connection to a rail route in downtown Berkeley, as well as like a shopping district and another shopping area as well down here. These 125 ramps were adopted by the city in the same year that this photograph was published. The disability community here interpreted independent living itself as a design challenge, right? And we can put this into the framework of what Amy Hemray and Kelly Fritsch call crip technoscience, a term describing, quote, the powerful, messy, non-innocent, contradictory, and nevertheless crucial work of critique, alteration, and reinvention of our material discursive world, which is to say, interventions in the built environment that are not focused on curing, fixing, or eliminating disability, but instead world building around disability, right? Creating routes, identifying spaces, rather than adding access to already existing constructions. Berkeley became a site of a particular kind of design that was not really seeking subtle or gentle approaches to access. Instead, these grassroots organizers sought a form of access that they had never experienced before, an independent, disabled-led movement in which they were the experts, and they became the experts, including designing the specific form of curb cut as well as its location, as their locations. To see another example of this at the offices of the Center for Independent Living, this is a staff picture that shows on the adaptation of a new office space. The CIL initially had office space in downtown Berkeley, and they essentially broke the fire code, which was built for maybe 1 or 2 wheelchair users or equipment users to be in a given space above the ground floor. And because they were holding like classes, job training classes and sessions and political organizing with large numbers of disabled people, they were shut down by the fire marshal. And so they relocated into a former car dealership, a former Alfa Romeo dealership on Telegraph Avenue, which is kind of the like hippie main street of UC Berkeley. They had to kind of invent their own space to use features like a large rolling door intended for cars to allow their wheelchairs and blind folks with canes and others to move freely in and out of the space without competing for that narrow doorway. Sorry, I lost my space here a little bit. So this mixed group of people sort of shows us in space how this process of design tended to work and how significantly it clashed with expected use of space, like office spaces or like sidewalks. And I wanted to show a bit of the sort of more architecture, capital A architecture side of this. This Center for Independent Living community not only became experts and advocates for access, but also collaborated with the architecture school at UC Berkeley in the architecture professor Raymond Lifshay's class, along with his student Marianne Heiserman, who was a wheelchair user and connected him to this community, sort of redesigned their studio space and their design process to incorporate accessible design charrettes and community visits. They used large empty classrooms with space in them for extra movement and built oversized models with shoebox units that could be moved and passed around and noting responses from their visitors. And I'm just gonna skip ahead here to a photograph within one of these models that shows how this like group-generated conversation led to perhaps unexpected types of conversations about access. So this photograph is not very good of looking down at the multiple layers of like paper staircases and torn elements, but what we're looking down into is a kind of living room space with a long corded telephone, a device that we may not have thought of as an access device, in fact now an obsolete form of technology, into a sort of carpeted center space and then a staircase over to the side. And there are notes within the model noting things like stairs float in space, provide nooks, outlooks, hiding above, and then above the figure sitting by the phone table is the comment, it's fun to sit in a spacious room and relax, looking from time to time upstairs. So what this seems to capture is a conversation about what function stairs play in a house, an already existing house form, for the member of the household who isn't using them to climb up and down the stairs. And this seems to capture the realities of home life for many disabled people in this community, living in older housing forms, often in group houses or multi-generational houses where disabled people were most likely to be living, making access where they could, and in households with both disabled and non-disabled members. So they might be sitting, observing in the living room, others might be upstairs. These were other aspects of community that really aren't documented in codes that only address specific users of a space. So I'm gonna shift a little bit here to another design sort of document of this period. But one of the things that sticks with me from these Berkeley experiments, especially around housing, is how they focus on aspects of accessibility that are not as straightforward as a ramp, a parking space, a sign, and so on. They're more relational between people, equipment, and space. And they're measures that can't really be well summarized in technical guidelines, but instead are the outcome of this kind of collaborative process and conversation in the design classroom. I've begun exploring concurrent ideas to the Berkeley case and to Ron Mesa's work, also in the 1970s, around design for people with cognitive and intellectual disabilities. Particularly those who are considered, quote unquote, severely disabled, which is to say, unable to care for themselves, who are often institutionalized or spend significant time in special care settings. Of course, even this definition itself, as one disability scholar says, there is no neutral term for intellectual disability, as it's highly constructed by our understandings of intellect and function. But we may consider how it is also constructed by physical environment. In most narratives of the history of access, including my own book, intellectually disabled people are not present. They're not presented as designers of their own lives. But as I continue to research this historical moment, again, I find myself in the 1970s with writings on new ideas about the environment that are inclusive of people with intellectual disabilities. So this example, for example, Humanizing Environments, was published in 1978, just a few years after Mesa's work and the Center for Independent Living work, who were rewriting approaches to mobility-related disabilities. This work features the work of Elaine Ostroff, who in fact was a collaborator of Ron Mace and a co-author of Universal Design Standards. Ostroff established an organization called Accessible Environments that did significant accessibility work in Boston in the 1980s and 1990s, including writing the access plan for the Boston subway, the T. But her background is not as an architect, nor was she a disabled person. But instead, she was an actor and theater educator who began in the 1970s to work on children's programming in the theater and sort of confronted the educational expectations around behavior for children's programming that led her to work with special education and specifically institutions for children with intellectual disabilities. So for Ostroff, issues of inclusion and education were entirely enmeshed with the design of environments, which were mostly designed to serve institutional staff rather than institutionalized people. So I'm gonna show some images here, and just to say they are hard images to look at in many ways, partly because they've covered the faces, they anonymize the children involved as they can't consent, but they bring our attention to the extent to which these children are in environments that are not designed for them. In the image on the left in particular, where a number of young people, young adolescents, are in a tile-walled, hard-floored space with limited seating and kind of walking around without much equipment. And on the right, you see some of the design interventions that Ostroff brought in, specifically a lot of large, padded, soft furniture and play things that Ostroff described as allowing them to, quote, have an effect on the world and affirm their existence. Padded shapes, rolling tubes, ramps, slides, and swings that they could move around on. These designers, for example, in a space that had no play space, designed a loft with a full staircase, beanbag chairs, pillows, and so on, where there had been simply only 1 to 2 step stairs and entirely only involved for physical therapy. One recurring design motif in this work is a kind of shallow basin into which various tactile materials could be collected. If it was a small basin, it could be like dried corn. If it was larger, it could be like styrofoam and cardboard scraps and things like that, that could fairly easily exist within institutional spaces by using like a prefabricated basin, like a kiddie pool. This miniature kind of created a miniature world of free movement and manipulation where children could play and make a mess without sort of disturbing the larger space, which seemed to be sort of the main priority for many of these institutional managers, and limiting their potential to harm other people or to damage the space. And I'm just starting to get into this research, so I apologize, it's kind of minimal in examples. But I'm really struck that today many of the methods that are used in these interventions into institutional spaces are familiar to us today, especially anyone who spends time in elementary schools, where spaces that are built for movements and sensory toys and equipment have become much more mainstream in the last 20 to 30 years. I'll cite as one example the pilot episode of the public school sitcom Abbott Elementary, which focuses on the need for a carpet for kindergartners to sit on. These are standard kind of open-ended, soft play spaces that are much more expected in early childhood education than they were at the time that these interventions were happening. So just as designing for wheelchair access prompted ideas about other audiences that were underserved by design, designing for bodies in motion that were not always in control has been hugely influential in early childhood education, but in other public spaces as well. What has started to be called sensory design, for example, at my own home institution, at the museum that my school is affiliated with, the Art Institute of Chicago, a major museum that consists of a building built in 1893, as well as several additions, including one built in 2009, so has a number of sort of access puzzle parts that come together. But the museum has started to identify access information by people's different access needs, so visitors who are deaf, or visitors who are blind, and visitors with autism or sensory processing disorders. So this is sort of a newer addition to this lingo that is not at all represented in architectural codes. In the last category, there are a series of sensory maps that the museum has made that highlight areas of the museum that have less overwhelming noise, crowds, and light. Areas are color-coded as more likely to be crowded and busy, or less likely. So this is a floor plan of one of the floors of the museum. Pardon me. In which green spaces show areas that are less likely to be loud and crowded. And red spaces, including kind of the main entrance to the museum, are coded as more loud and crowded. Interestingly, the sensory map is also a map toward non-Western art and so-called applied arts, arts of Asia, India, Native American and African art, and textiles, for example, are among the least crowded. So this creates a kind of maybe unexpected, I can say, without a doubt, unexpected kind of secondary version of the map. The second part of the sensory map is about lighting that shows areas with natural light or low light. In this case, right, a main entrance to the Renzo Piano modern wing with a massive atrium is more, a natural light space, for example, and then spaces, again, that often are the spaces of Asian art, African art, Native American art that are often not with bright white walls, that have sort of more varied low light, and also have a predominance of paper and textiles that require lower light, are also highlighted. So I can't help but read these sensory design maps as an illustration of how this more recent arrival into access conversations layers on top of already existing pathways that are created by wheelchair accessibility, as well as by modern ideas around culture and materials conservation. These forms of access that were developed for a highly marginalized population, one that was often subject to forced incarceration, and a system of medical institutions that was drastically defunded in the 1980s, today are often mislabeled or misunderstood. So for example, the map of loud and crowded spaces, there's no way that you can pass through the museum through only quieter spaces. Likewise, it's very unpredictable, right, which spaces, depending on passing, temporary exhibitions and so on. Likewise, these maps only link from the autism and sensory processing link, not, for example, from the blind and low vision link, whereas many blind people are highly sensitive to light, right? So the kind of misunderstandings seem to chase the greater complexity of access issues. And finally, to just state the obvious, these maps and divisions have no relationship whatsoever to curatorial programming. So for example, we could imagine a map that showed representation of disability in the museum's collection, which is widely represented in all manner of cultural materials that are represented in the museum. These kinds of labelings do not interact with these access maps. Nonetheless, these maps bring me back to think about Park MacArthur's ramps installation again, and its simultaneous attention to the specifics of access, its materiality, these professionally finished ramps and these scraps of plywood, and also what lies beyond, what can't be pictured, and might even require some Wikipedia reading to understand. MacArthur lays bare the ridiculousness and difficulty of her own participation in the art world, even giving us an ethical quandary around removing access in other places. But it gives us an opportunity to really look at the details and mechanics of access, where nearly all of these ramps are temporary, and therefore sort of represent something that is usually hidden away, right? These tend to be stored and then brought out only when they are required, as opposed to being permanent installations. What we include when designing or thinking about access matters very much. The presence of disabled people themselves, their input and participation in design practices, the recognition of our own skills and knowledge when it comes to designing environments, are all components that rarely show up in a kind of official presence of access, or certainly in the legal code. In this more recent work on sensory design, I'm considering populations that have been systemically excluded from decision-making about their own lives, even down to access to movement and play. But in other cases too, the elite museum or the architecture school classroom, we can consider when access is a bare minimum, a kind of checklist item, and when it's allowed to be a process in motion, like Mace's swooshing wheelchair. We can invite ourselves, or I invite you to consider access as a kind of process, and how this might change how we design for it. Thank you.